Lord be with you. So just a reminder again that today is the third Sunday of the month, and as usual on the third Sunday after the homily we have an open question-answer discussion, so tune up your minds. Also for today I've put together a kind of a collage of readings that serve the purpose of the homily. The homily is basically going about Eucharist and what Eucharist means. So I've stitched together a reading from Mark, a reading from John, and a reading from Paul, all of which address the same basic topic. Starting with Mark. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. Then he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." Then we shift into John's version. Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." On hearing this, many of his disciples says, "This is hard teaching. Who can accept it?" Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you? The words I have spoken to you, they are spirit and they are life. The spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing." And finally, Paul, "I declare to you, my brothers and sisters, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable." Words inspired by God. I'm going to start the homily today by making a controversial statement. It may be regarded as being judgmental or maybe even prejudicial, but I'll explain what I mean by it. And the statement is this. When it comes to celebrating Eucharist, Protestants are like stodgy adults relying on memory, and Catholics are like creative children relying on imagination. So in other words, mostly Catholics are participants in a mystery when they celebrate Eucharist, and Protestants are attendees at a memorial service for Jesus. So they're regarding it as something that happened 2,000 years ago. So the key to it is the difference between memory and imagination. And I've defined what I mean by imagination for you many, many times, so I'll do it again. Imagination is not the faculty that allows us to make up stuff which isn't real. That's not imagination, that's fantasy. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift my state of consciousness, surf different dimensions of reality, encounter different energies and different entities, observe them, interact with them, learn from them, and then bring back the learning into this state of consciousness and cross-fertilize it here so that I can extend my maps of reality, my cartography. And so that's what I'm going to talk about this morning vis-a-vis Eucharist. I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. And the first one would be, I'm going to talk about the evolution of time. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about story as the archive of spirit. And then I'm going to talk about the Eucharist resurrection connection. And finally, I'm going to talk about the Eucharistic Code. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So firstly, the evolution of time. A genius called Hugh Everett III was a brilliant physicist in the 1960s who studied under probably the most famous American physicist of all time, a guy called John Wheeler, back in Princeton. And Hugh Everett was the guy who came up with the notion of parallel universes. But it was so controversial, he was scoffed and kind of laughed out of court that he abandoned completely the academic world and retired into almost relative obscurity. But he continued to develop his theory. Only very, very recently has the idea gained, real traction, the notion of parallel universes or parallel cosmoses. So he was a very unhappy man. He said life work, this great, great insight had just fallen on deaf ears. And so he was an avowed atheist. And the instructions he left in his will was that when he died, he was to be cremated and his ashes were to be thrown out with the garbage. I kid you not. His wife kind of demurred from this, and she actually kept his ashes for 3 or 4 years, and then finally she honored his request, and his ashes were thrown out with the garbage. And so although there's a headstone that says Hugh Everett III, there's nothing there. There are no ashes there, there's no body there. And so his ashes were literally just thrown out with the garbage. This is how disillusioned he was with what happened in his life. But he came up with this extraordinary notion, which now science is getting fully behind, and which I totally subscribe to. And it's when I talk about the evolution of time, here's what I have in mind. So if I were to say to you, for instance, can you remember a time that, and you fill in the blank, or if I were to say to you instead of, can you remember a time that, if I said to you, can you imagine a time that, if I just change one word, instead of saying remember a time, I ask you to imagine a time. Something very, very different is happening to you. If I say to you, can you remember a time that you're connecting to a notion of a singular linear universe that moves from past to present to the future? So you're going to trawl your memory banks and pick out, a few incidences. If I say to you, can you imagine a time that you're in a totally different reality? Now you're into Hugh Everett's world. Now your imagination is going to allow you to fashion alternative universes. And so my contention is that if you know how to use your imagination properly, you can connect and create parallel universes. So it is totally possible for you to reconnect with any historical event and participate in it in any way that you choose to. And so when I think, as a Catholic priest, when I think of Eucharist, or when I celebrate Eucharist here, what I'm doing for myself is I'm creating a parallel universe in which I'm a participant and an attendee at the Last Supper with Jesus. And that's open to everybody. If you really know what imagination is about, you realize that you literally can spin off parallel universes, even from a historical event, and be part of that insofar as you choose to be it. The only limitation is how well you're able to surf interdimensionally on the board of your imagination. And so when I talk about, the Protestant versus the Catholic version, I'm talking about the difference between somebody who can get aboard their imagination and participate in any way they choose in the Last Supper of Jesus or any historical event of your choice. That when you know that parallel universes is a reality, then there's nothing stopping you from spinning off one in which you can even be a major player. You can be an observer, or you can be a major player in the drama. And that's what it means, really, to participate in Eucharist as far as I'm concerned. So we're stuck in a kind of a model of reality, in spite of what science is telling us, where we believe that time is a unidirectional phenomenon that goes from the past to the present to the future. The problem is we don't inhabit either of the three. For most of us, the present moment is constantly hijacked into a pseudo-future, which is filled with anxiety and fear, or is hijacked into a pseudo-memory, which is hijacked by guilt or by, some kind of anger about what was done to us. So there's none of us living in the present moment, almost none of us living in the present moment. Now, when memory fails us, we're destined to not be able to recover our past. So when memory fails, there is no past for us. When our awareness fails, there is no present for us. So most of us, there is no present time for most of us because we are so totally unaware that the present moment is constantly escaping. So when there is no awareness, there is no present moment. When there is no memory, there is no past. And when there is no imagination, there is no future. And so most of us are inhabiting a world in which we neither have a present, a past, nor a future. We are hijacking what this moment, for anxiety, pseudo futures with anxiety, and fear, and pseudo memories based on guilt and anger. And so it just slips by constantly. And so the real use of time is the ability to inhabit the present moment with such total awareness and such total clarity that we can reconnect with the past and spin off alternative universes and thus create the future of our choice. It was Abraham Lincoln who said very famously one time, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And we create it through our imaginations. And so the only really valid use of the present moment is to use the present moment to trawl the past for important memories that we can then spin off into alternate universes and thus create a future that allows us to grow, not just as individual people, but as an entire species. It is people with the ability to be totally aware in the present moment who can create a future in which, instead of a nuclear holocaust, there will be Christ consciousness in our times. This is not going to be done by technicians. It's not going to be done by scientists. It's going to be done with people who are allying imagination to compassion. That is, these are the people who are going to create the only future worth living in. That's my first point. Second point is this: stories as the archives of spirit. I addressed this a little bit at the St. Patrick's Day party before I began to tell some stories myself. So I'm totally convinced that when cultures meet, two interesting things happen. If you remember your math from a set theory, when two sets come together, there's a union of the sets, which means all the data pieces contained in all of them are part of the union. But the intersection set is only those data points which are contained in both. If it's not contained in both, it doesn't appear in the intersection set. My experience has been this, that when two cultures meet or clash, the technologies expand. They become the union of the two civilizations, but the cosmologies shrink enormously. They become the intersection set of the two. And so what happens, if enough cultures get together, eventually the intersection set gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The technology expands exponentially, but the cosmology shrinks. And so finally, we're left in our times, in a Western civilization, with a cosmology that tells us nothing is real, except that which can be sensed either directly through our sensorium or by extension through our instrumentation. And so we're living in a dead world, a jaded world, a demythologized, de-romanticized world in which we face a future of just nuclear holocaust or degradation of various kinds because the intersection set is so small. Now, the good news is that there are shamans and storytellers who have archived the old cosmologies, so that when we finally wake up to our senses, the data are there, or the seeds are there to plant a new garden, a garden of love and a garden of hope. And so the great archivists of the future are the storytellers of the present and of the past. And so our storytelling becomes the archives that give us the possibility of resurrecting a cosmology in which, once more, there's romance, there's room for the paranormal, there's mystery, and there's magic contained in it. Now, I'm convinced that storytelling has done three things for human beings. Homo sapiens sapiens only evolved about 50,000 years ago. 200,000 years ago, we had Homo sapiens, which meant thinking people. They could think, but they couldn't think about thinking because they didn't have language. Only language allows us to be able to think about thinking. And so only with the advent of language 50,000 years ago could we really begin to address the great existential issues. Who are we? Where do we come from? What happens after we die? Are there gods? These kinds of things. And so when language came into being, the first way we employed it was in storytelling. And storytelling has many functions. The first, function of storytelling is that it allows us to make sense of our experiences during the day. So we're out hunting, different groups of us, and we come back and you tell me you've met a saber-toothed tiger, and I tell you I've met a mammoth, and we share the stories, and somehow we've extended our cosmology. And so storytelling is to share the wisdom. That's the first function of it. The second function is that it is the first way human beings discovered to volitionally shift our states of consciousness. There are many other ways of doing it. You can do it through, hallucinogens. You can do it through fasting. You can do it through pain. But the first way we discovered was through storytelling. Because when you listen to a story well told, and you know how to listen to a story, then what's happening is that you're shifting your state of consciousness. And the second thing you do with it is it allows you to warp time. It allows you to spin off parallel universes. And the third thing it does then, it archives this wisdom so that it's not lost for future generations. So when you tell a story to a little child, 3-year-old child, or Olivia right here, you tell a story to Olivia and watch what happens to her eyes. Her eyes get bigger and bigger and bigger. Because not only is she joining in the telling of it, she's spinning off a parallel universe in which she's an active participant in the story you're telling. And when you end your story, she'll continue the story. She'll continue to give life to this parallel universe that she's created for herself. And that's the difference mainly between kids and the rest of us. The most of us think that stories are just ways to entertain. They're that, but they're a smuggling device. There's a great story from the Sufi tradition set in the 1300s of a guy who lived on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And once a month he'd go across the border with his herd of donkeys, maybe 30 donkeys. And the border guards knew that he was smuggling. They were totally convinced he was smuggling. But they could never find what he was smuggling. They would look in the donkey's ears and they'd lift the donkey's tail, and they'd open the donkey's mouth, look at the saddlebags. They could never find out what he was smuggling. Every single month he'd go across the border for years and years and years and years. And finally one of the border guards retired. And he met this guy in a marketplace, in a different country. And he says, it's killing me. We all know that you've been smuggling, but we could never figure out what it was. I'm no longer part of the border patrol, so this is just between you and me. Please tell me, it's killing me. What were you smuggling? And the guy said, donkeys. Okay. And that's what stories do. Stories are a smuggling device. And what they do is, they're smuggling our ability to warp time. They're smuggling our ability to shift our states of consciousness. They're smuggling in the archived cosmology and wisdom of other ages. And so when we think of the story of Eucharist, or the story of Jesus, or the story of Moses, or the story of any of these great characters, they're not just entertainment from the past. The entertainment is the smuggling device that gets the wisdom into our consciousness. And so the story of Eucharist, or the story of resurrection, these are invitations for us also to spin off parallel universes in which we can be active participants in those events. There are real universes. This is not just make-believe. This is not fiction. This is not fantasy. This is the ability as human beings to spin off universes in which you experience the things you're hearing from the storyteller. And that's the difference between a good storyteller and a poor storyteller, or between a good listener and a poor listener. A bad storyteller is just trying to entertain somebody, and a bad listener is somebody who's just smiling at the fiction. A good storyteller is somebody who knows that what he's telling you is true, and a good listener is somebody who's recreating the experience for themselves. So that's what Eucharist is about. That's my second point. Third point then, I want to pull together then Eucharist and resurrection. And that's why I chose this collage today. Because both Paul and Jesus make almost identically the same statement. After Jesus has spoken about Eucharist, he goes on and he says, the words I spoke to you are spirit and they are life. It's the spirit that gives life. Flesh availeth nothing. Now, you look at a very, very interesting thing here. Christ is talking about, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will not have life in you. And this disgusts his audience. Oh my God, are you advocating cannibalism? And when it was almost too late, Jesus realized that he'd pushed it too hard. He'd pushed the image too hard, that the audience wasn't ready for it. And finally, when the few who came back to him and says, this is crazy stuff, we can't accept this craziness. And he said, don't you realize that the words I spoke to you are spirit and life? The flesh availeth nothing. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 15, when he's talking about the resurrection of Jesus, he uses exactly the same phrase. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So our problem is with the word body, the body of Christ, or the resurrected body of Christ. So let me deal with this for a few moments. We operate in the West with an extraordinarily impoverished model, understanding of what body means. We think the body is just this physical spacesuit with tendons and ligaments and bones and tissue and that kind of stuff. We think that's what the body is. It's a totally impoverished model of what body is. The Egyptians had two notions of body, ka and ba. One is the physical spacesuit, and the other is the metaphysical template from which the physical spacesuit was created. So there's a two-tier model of what body means. The Greeks, and the New Testament is written in Greek, and Paul is writing in Greek. There are three words in Greek for body: sarx, soma, and pneuma. Sarx means this stuff here, flesh and blood. Soma means the psychic body, and pneuma means the spirit body. And what Paul is saying, if you were reading Paul in the original, he is saying, sarx cannot inhabit the kingdom of God. Flesh and blood cannot inhabit the kingdom of God. So when Paul is talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and Jesus is talking about eating his body and blood, he is not talking about sarx. It's not that if you're a Catholic and you believe that at the moment of consecration that the bread and wine are turned into the body and blood of Jesus, and then you come to communion, that somebody, somewhere is chewing on his femur, or that somebody has just bitten into his kidney somewhere. We're not talking about a physical body. We're talking about a totally different level. So Hinduism does it best. Hinduism has 7 different levels of what body means. And they're all vibrating at different frequencies. So there's the physical body, that they call the gross body, vibrating between 400 and 700 nanometers, so between the infrared and ultraviolet range, so we can see it. And then there's a second level of body they call the etheric body, and it's vibrating at a higher frequency. And it's the body you sometimes see, if you can see auras, that's what you're actually looking at. And in fact, you can gauge the health of the physical body much more accurately by looking at the etheric body than by looking at the physical body itself. And that's the origin of vibrational medicine, or homeopathy, or Ayurvedic medicine, or Qi, Chinese medicine. They're treating the etheric energy system. The third level of body they would call the astral body, and that's the body we inhabit when we're dreaming. We're traveling, interdimensionally in our dream life. The fourth level of body they call the mental body, and it's like Plato's ideal realm, the place from which we download all great ideas. The fifth level of body they call it's the psychic body, the place where we discover our clairvoyant, telepathic, clairaudient, psychokinetic abilities, and we all have them because we're all plugged in to Source. The sixth level is Atman, individual soul, and the seventh is Brahmanic consciousness, which is the creative source. And so Hinduism has a totally different version of it. So when Christ is talking about eating his body and drinking his blood, he's talking about an encounter at a totally different level of being. Let me use another analogy. Some years ago, I had this really interesting vision where I saw like a diagram, and at the top of the diagram was love. But love had given birth to twins. And one of the twins was called light, and the other twin was called logos. And light, as it begins to densify, becomes matter, and logos, as it begins to densify, becomes mind. And then mind and matter interact, and they create life. And when life finally becomes totally self-aware, it leads to laughter. So it's L's all the way down, from love to light and logos, to life and to laughter. Now, this laughter is not about a derisory laughter. It is the total joy of coming fully awake and realizing the illusion you had been living up to then. When you fully realize that this is a dream that your ego is having, and that the ego is a dream that your soul is having, and that your soul is a dream that your spirit is having, and that your spirit is a dream that God is having, then you realize you're living in this nest of dreams. And then you laugh at the absurdity of being fooled by the dream and thinking, that the most important thing was your physical body or your ideas or your emotions. Now, I'm not saying they're not important, they are important, but they don't have the same level of importance. And so as light begins to densify, there are less and less subtle articulations of it. And as logos begins to densify, there are less and less subtle articulations. So at this basic level here, you got very dense matter interacting with very dumb minds, and we call that combination human beings. If you go higher up the scale, there are much more subtle levels of matter interacting with much more subtle levels of mind, and we might call those angelic beings. And there's a law in place for us at the bottom, and it's called the law of deferred outcome. So because thought is creative, everything that exists was originally a thought somewhere. Now, if we could translate our thoughts into actions, if we could manifest them immediately, our world would be littered with dead bodies. Because every time I had an angry thought about somebody, I'm going to kill that bastard. There'd be a dead bastard at the other end of it. So there's the law of deferred outcome. Human beings don't have the ability to translate thoughts into immediate manifestation. You have to be much higher up the scale before you're allowed to do that. And so when Christ is talking about Eucharist, when he's talking about resurrection, he's talking about encounters much higher up that level, where there's a superior level of mind meeting a superior level of matter, and that's where the interaction is taking place. And so Eucharist and resurrection can only be understood if we realize, the level at which they're talking. Which brings me to my final point. I call it the Eucharistic Code. And it's always fascinated me that if you look at the difference between the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, versus John's Gospel, all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, mention the Last Supper, but they devote about 15 verses of one chapter to the Last Supper. But they talk about the institution of Eucharist in those 15 verses. John devotes 5 entire chapters, about 155 verses to the Last Supper, and he never mentions the institution of the Eucharist. So it's like so weird. Wow. John has 155 chapters, about the Last Supper and never once mentions Eucharist. The other guys only have 15 verses, and then most of it is about Eucharist. So what's the deal here? You have to learn to identify Eucharist through a code, a hidden code. So there's actually 2 versions of Eucharist in John's Gospel, one in chapter 6 and one in chapter 21. Except that instead of bread and wine, it's bread and fishes. So in one story, he's feeding a group in the desert with bread and fishes. And the second story, a group of the disciples have an encounter with him after he has risen from the dead, and he feeds them with fish that he's been cooking. Now, you have to recognize there's a hidden code. You can always recognize the presence of Eucharist when you see these 4 phrases, no matter where they appear in the Gospels. He took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. And wherever you find those 4 phrases, you're in the presence of Eucharist. So I want to tease those apart now as my last point here. So what does it mean when it says that Jesus took? It didn't mean that he just grabbed stuff. It meant that he received with total gratitude. Now, it's the difference between the old-style farmer. When I grew up as a kid in Ireland, there was a blessing when you were setting the seed in the springtime. There was a blessing if you were doing any kind of weeding in your garden. There was a blessing at the time of harvesting it. There was a blessing the mothers did when they were cooking the food or baking the bread. And there was the blessing you said before you eat the meal. So it was blessed at every stage. There was gratitude at each stage. Gratitude with the setting, gratitude with the weeding, gratitude with the harvesting, gratitude with the cooking, and gratitude with the eating. Compare that now to what I call the Monsanto grab and gobble. You grab stuff because it's your right, and you eat it unthinkingly. So that's a totally different encounter. And so Christ is reminding us that our Mother, the Earth, provides everything we have, we've got from our Mother, the Earth. Every single carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen in our bodies, we've gotten from Mother Earth. Everything we're wearing, everything we're breathing, all the food we're eating, we're getting from our Mother. And Christ is saying then, you take that with gratitude and with awareness. You don't just grab it. And so Eucharist is about mindfully being grateful to our Mother, Gaia, for everything that she's given to us. The second stage then is he blessed it. And we erroneously think that, Christ took a piece of an inert substance called bread, and he did some kind of, signal over it, and suddenly it was his body and blood. So that he blessed it. He imparted some kind of benediction to a previously inert substance. And that is not what blessedness consists of. Blessedness is not about imparting something that wasn't there. It's about recognizing something that was always present. And so blessing something is the recognition of its inherent sanctity. I put it to you, is it a more blessed act to be able to create something ex nihilo or just, receive something? The great blessing came with the creation of what you're now eating. And so the recognition of that is where we participate in the blessing process. So to bless the bread and wine at the Eucharist is to recognize that these are inherently sacred things, sacred elements. And we're having received them with gratitude, we're now recognizing the blessedness of them. And then we're told he broke it, he broke the bread. Breaking has to do with creating models of justice to ensure that all beings are accepted and welcome to the banquet of God's largesse. So it's creating models. Now, it's one thing to try to combat individual acts of injustice, but when you have to combat institutionalized injustice, the only response to institutionalized injustice is institutionalized compassion. And it's really painful to me to watch what our government is doing here and elsewhere, with our elderly or our children feeding programs for kids, that we're withdrawing money, from the needy and the marginalized, and we can put it into B-52 bombers or drones or stealths or whatever. And so wherever there is institutionalized injustice, there is a need for institutionalized compassion. And that is what Christ is indicating in the breaking of the bread. It is forming the intention and creating the kinds of models, the agricultural models, the scientific models, the political models, whatever they are, to ensure that all God's creatures, and by all God's creatures, I don't just mean all human beings, I mean all living beings have a right to come to God's banquet. And then the fourth piece of it, finally, is he distributed it. So having models is one thing, but if we're not walking our models into reality, if we're not walking our talk, they're pieces of paper. So it has to translate into action. We have to become part then of the realization that This extraordinary symbol that Christ left us, in my opinion, is the most feminine symbol in all of Scripture. It used to fascinate me in my years in Africa to watch a young mother breastfeeding her baby, because I got it immediately that this wasn't just about the transfer of milk from a breast to a mouth. It was a total attitude of, on the part of the mother, total love and total protection, and on the part of the child, total trust that all his needs were going to be provided for. And that's the symbol that Christ left us, the symbol of a total devotion on the part of the mother and total trust on the part of the child. And just as this mother, in fact, she built this baby molecule by molecule in her own womb. And then having given birth to it, she put it on her heart, next to her heart, on her breast, and she fed it from her breast. So she created it from her body, and she feeds it from her body. And that's what Christ is saying. This is our relationship with God. In some senses, we've been created from the body of God, and we're nurtured on the body of God. And so in some senses, when we understand Eucharist is a fractal representation of the evolutionary journey from God's womb to God's heart. All of the cosmoses, all of the universes that exist, all of manifestation is simply a single safari that started out in God's womb and ends up in God's heart. When all of us have come to the realization that only love is real, the safari is finished, and then the game folds up. And so to understand Eucharist is to realize that a Eucharistic encounter, such as we'll have later on, is literally a fractal reenactment of the entire story of evolution. Okay. So let's open up to Anne-Marie. How are you doing? Good. Okay. Did you have a comment or to add something? Jennifer?
You once asked me to do something.
Yes.
And I haven't done it yet.
I'm on your case.
And I'm torn between different philosophies.
Okay.
One of them is that when you're in healthcare, you become privileged to know people in a very special way.
Absolutely.
And it's confidential.
Totally. Mm-hmm.
So I find it difficult for me to give myself permission to disperse the experience.
Yeah.
And today I finally understood what you were driving at.
Good. So you're on board? Do you want to say what the task is?
I've been a nurse for over 60 years. And it's been a very rewarding experience. I love doing what I do. And in that time, changes became available to society. And the one I'm dealing with is resuscitation of patients when they die, to see if you can have them continue on with their lives. The initial purpose of resuscitation was not to restore people to life. It was for us to get organ donors, so you must know that.
Okay.
There was a different reason for it.
Okay.
And most of the organ donors that come are from young men that ride motorcycles and have really bad accidents.
Mm-hmm.
They're between the ages of 18 and 25. Mm-hmm. Physical specimens that are perfect.
Yes.
And if we could keep those bodies functioning until a team could come to use literally the word harvest their body, so that they could extend many people's quality of lives with kidneys, eyes, hearts, whatever. And in that time, I have personally been involved with 33 people, some just narrating what happened to them, others that I actually participated in. And it's shocking when you participate in this and then you find out that the patient actually recognized you and what you were doing, and they tell you, I know you from the sound of your voice. You're the nurse that said, stand back, everybody, I'm going to zap them. And I looked at this man, this is the next day in the ICU, and I'm going, oh my God, nobody ever told me they would be able to see the event, but they do. It's just amazing. So, I'm going to have to think some more.
Okay.
But I want you to know that if you ever have to go to a hospital, and there are people there taking care of you, most of them really love what they do.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a million. Thanks a million, Anne-Marie. Thanks a million. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Some people didn't hear it, so let me give you a synopsis. Okay. Anne-Marie has been a nurse for over 60 years. And she did a lot of her work had to do with resuscitation. And what she said was that initially, a resuscitation, was in order to preserve a body for purposes of harvesting organs, because many people who appeared in the ICU were young men between the ages of 18 and 25, who had been involved in horrendous automobile crashes or motorbike crashes. So they were just trying to keep them alive so they could harvest the organs. But what you began to realize is that, when other people who were dead, clinically dead, began reporting that they were aware of what was happening in their environment. So I've been on Anne-Marie's case for 2 or 3 years now, that she needs to write a book on near-death experiences because she's been witness to them, and has interacted with patients who report near-death experiences. So this is what she's been talking about today. 60 years of working in situations like this, with encounters with people who've been fully aware, being able to describe the environment, although they were totally unconscious, and reporting, and totally dead, clinically dead. Right. Okay. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Okay, lovely. Johanna, behind your mic.
I have kind of part of it's a St. Patrick's Day question, but you said that the humans would be here on a vibrational level, and then angelic beings would be here.
Yeah.
And where do you think animals are?
Okay.
And then where do you think, I'm not saying this right, the Tuatha De Danann are?
Okay. So that's a great question. And I want to differentiate between the spirit and the spacesuit. That's very important. So in this model that I just outlined of love giving birth to light and logos, light morphing into matter and logos morphing into a mind, and then these combining to create life, and a fully aware life leads to laughter. I'm talking about now the phenomenon of the physical spacesuit. Now, it is totally possible, in my cosmology at least, that a very advanced soul might take occupancy in an animal body for an incarnation. That an avatar might decide for the next incarnation, I'm going to choose an experience as, a kitten. And within that spacesuit, live as lovingly as possible. In fact, there's a great story about the Buddha himself, that in one incarnation, the Buddha was a deer, an antelope, that sacrificed himself. He came in the desert, or at least in the forest, upon an old sadhu, a wandering holy man who was sitting at a fire, freezing, trying to warm himself, and starving to death. And the deer sacrificed itself, ran into the flames, and immolated itself in order to provide food for this starving sadhu. And that deer was actually an incarnation of the Buddha. So don't mistake the spacesuit for the spirit. Very, very advanced spirits can take up occupancy in an oak tree, in a river, in a human being, as an angel. So you have to differentiate between the spacesuit and the spirit. Now, when you inhabit a spacesuit, you're limited by the abilities of the spacesuit. If you decide to have an incarnation as a rock, you're immobilized in the sense that you're not going to be able to take up and walk around. If you're, decide to incarnate as a flower, you can wave in the wind and you can send off scents of various kinds, but you're not going to be able to think self-reflectively. So you can choose any medium to experience an incarnation. And so we have to be very, very careful that we're not mixing up the spacesuit with the spirit inside it. Now, if you take both factors together, very, very often more advanced beings will take up occupancy of more advanced kinds of spacesuits. Because in some senses, they can be maybe of more benefit, if they're in spacesuits that allow the full expression of their gifts. And so what you tend to find is that in the angelic realm, you get much more intelligent, much more evolved souls whose function is to act as guardians for individual human beings. The more advanced ones in my belief system act as guardians for entire nations, or maybe for entire galaxies, that there may be an angelic guardian in charge of a galaxy. I think that angels of sufficient, evolutionary levels are guiding the process of evolution itself. And that certainly when any planet is on the verge of some kind of extraordinary shift in consciousness, either that's going to obliterate them through their technology or advance them into Christ consciousness through their mindfulness, angels are midwifing that process. Yeah. Margaret.
When you're talking about imagination,
Okay. Yeah.
I grew up with make-believe.
Yes.
And you did mention make-believe. Did I miss the difference?
Yes. So you're saying there's three words here. There's make-believe, fantasy, and imagination. Now, the problem, when you say you grew up with make-believe, are you talking about as a little child, or I presume you're talking about?
No.
Okay. So make-believe is the ability to suspend reality and to indulge in fantasy. So for me, make-believe and fantasy are the ability to kind of create something ex nihilo. Imagination is very different. Imagination is the single most important gift that human beings have, in my opinion. And even scientists, the really great scientists are separated from the technicians in their trade by their imagination. So, for instance, there's a great story told about Einstein, when the president of Princeton was trying to persuade him to come across from Europe and work in Princeton. And he was used to offering very, very famous scientists $30,000 worth of equipment to kind of lure them in. And he goes to interview Einstein. And he says, Dr. Einstein, of course I will set up a really, really elaborate laboratory for you. So you tell me what kind of equipment you need, and I'll make sure it's there. And Einstein says, well, I'm definitely going to need a little table and a chair. I like to sit down. And lots of paper. I need lots of paper. And a whole bunch of pencils. And the guy says, and the equipment? Einstein says, no, that's it, just that. Because his laboratory was his imagination. He would sit on a photon of light and travel off into the universe and watch what happened to mass and length and time. So the truly great scientists are using their imagination. So what happens? Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift my state of consciousness, travel into other dimensions of reality, interact with and observe other entities and other energies, learn from them, and then bring that new information back and cross-fertilize it with this physical reality. So it's very different from fantasy. Fantasy is just like a flight of fancy that goes nowhere. Imagination is very different. All the great products, you take anything you're using, an iPad, an iPhone, or whatever, that was an imaginative journey by somebody, Steve Jobs or somebody else. It came in an imaginative, journey that got translated by technicians into physical, apparatus. So imagination is huge, and it is huge in the spiritual journey as well. Imagination is the key, in my opinion, to deep spirituality, mystical spirituality. You're not going to get there through ritual. You're not going to get there just, following kind of legalisms of your dogmatic, revealed creedal formulations. That's not going to get you anywhere except compliance. You really want to soar, you want to become a mystic, you're going to have to use your imagination. Imagination, time with little children, and time spent alone in nature. They're the three keys to mysticism. Ria.
It's just, would you say that Hawking would be an example of an imaginative person? He's in a wheelchair.
Oh, Stephen Hawking's.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Right.
Totally. There's a brilliant exemplar. Even at this stage, I just heard very, very recently that, his system is even further shutting down. So he's got some kind of a device in the right lens of his glasses right now, which is allowing him to communicate with the computer and talk. So his system is shutting down more and more and more. But his imagination is as brilliant as ever. There's not a scrap of physical evidence, behind what he's thinking or doing. This is a total flight of fantasy, which is subsequently being verified by empirical observation, but is coming from imagination first. Because whether he realizes it or not, I would agree with that cosmology, he's surfing the dimensions and he's interacting with different levels of reality. So that's a brilliant example, or exemplar of it. Thanks, Ria. Yeah. Alfred.
I happen to believe that every meal can be a Eucharist. I am greatly disturbed by a philosophy that seems to be abroad in the United States and in Europe that says the poor and the undeserving have created their own misery, and it would be wrong for us to bail them out by providing aid to the poor, by providing meals, by providing food, by providing any kind of sustenance. Could you make an observation
Yeah,
about that?
I'm 101% behind you, Alfred. You're totally in agreement. It's based on an extraordinarily greedy cosmology. It doesn't work, for the first thing. It's pragmatically, it does not work. But much more importantly, I'm convinced that we come into planet Earth as groups of souls. I call them preconception contracts. And there are different levels of the preconception contract. So there's somebody you'll come in, there's a soul you'll come in with that becomes your anima chara, your soul mate. There's a group of souls you're going to come in with and they become your family. There's a group of souls that you come in with and they become your culture. There's a group of souls you come in with and they become the human species. There's a group of souls that comes together and it's all sentient beings on planet Earth and various levels. Nobody comes in to planet Earth on a contract to be a loner. We come in because we're roped together. And somebody will only agree to an incarnation as a homeless or impoverished person on the understanding that there are other people agreeing to come in to incarnate at the same time who have the resources to address those needs. So that one person is learning trust and the other person is learning compassion. So everybody in the equation is learning. What happens is, of course, we come in and there's amnesia created for us for who we are and why we came here. And so the haves grab tightly to what they have, believing they deserve it, and they ignore the other people as their responsibility, that they got up their asses and worked, they wouldn't be hungry. So it's a total rejection of the very contract that brought us to planet Earth in the first place. There's a trust element to one side of it and a compassion element to the other, and if any one of these elements is missing, the contract is being broken. It's our duty to make sure that all the resources of planet Earth are available to all living beings, whether they're birds or banana slugs, according to their needs. And you operate from that model. Gandhi said famously one time, there's enough for everybody's need, but there's not enough for everybody's greed. That's the difference between the models. Mike?
If it's your imagination, I'll just take what you just said. My imagination sees the cosmos differently.
Okay.
How do we know? How do we know?
Absolutely, because you're spinning off a parallel universe. It's not that yours is wrong and mine is right, or mine is right and yours is wrong. You're spinning off a cosmos in which you are now being invited to live with as much alignment and compassion and love as possible. And you've created one in which you're living and you're being invited to live lovingly there. And I'm creating one from the universe I'm spinning off in which I'm being invited to live with as much love as possible. So there's no question of right or wrong. There's as many universes as will accommodate our needs. According to quantum mechanical theory, there are 10 to the power of 27 brand new universes created every second for every cubic centimeter of 11-dimensional mathematical space. It's a lot of universes.
It seems to me then what you're saying is there is no reality. There's no reality.
What I'm saying
just
is,
imagination.
there's not reality in the sense of objectively verifiable place such that if we all get the reality, we're all seeing the same thing. Reality is the realization of the mystery of the journey. That's the reality, and that's totally real. And therefore, your experience of reality is where you're being called to grow. And my experience of reality is where I'm being called to grow. Now, there have to be some orienting kind of principles. If my model of reality is making me a violent, greedy person visiting my rage in others, then that model is really dysfunctional. A lot of people are going to suffer from it.
It's not dysfunctional for you. That's what you want.
So
who am I to say that if you have... if you get your kicks or your life is satisfied through violence, well, I imagine that you're not.
Okay,
right?
okay, I hear you.
Who's right?
Okay, well, who's right is that there are orienting principles, and the orienting principles, trump all the individual versions. And the orienting principles, the basic oriental principle is love. If my model is creating love in the environment, then that model is a better model than a model which is creating violence. So there are, when I say life is a journey that starts in God's womb and ends in God's heart, the trajectory of that is a journey from love to love through all kinds of diversions and detours. But the trajectory is a trajectory of love. And that is the single most important orienting principle. And anything that deviates from that, is a lesser model than cosmology that aligns with that. So there is some kind of orienting mechanisms by which we can check it out.
I don't want to pursue this too much, but you seem to say that love is crucial to it all.
Yes.
I mean, I happen to agree with you that that's the foundation of everything. But let's say I don't agree with you. I think it's made up of hatred and destruction.
Okay.
And the only purpose is to survive and get the most you can.
Okay.
Screw love.
Yeah. I get it. That's where a lot of our world is working. And therefore, at that stage, you have to say, by their fruits you shall know them. What kind of a world is that creating? Is that creating a world in which the vast bulk of people are experiencing harmony and love and their needs met? Or is it creating a world of want and need? And so feedback is really important. That's why I said, the present moment without awareness is lost. Without awareness, there is no present moment. Without, memory, there is no past. Without imagination, there is no future. Awareness is the key component to the now. And awareness consists of knowing who I am and what my purpose is. And when I'm fully awake to that, there's only one answer. I'm a bite-sized piece of God having a human experience, and my mission is to create Christ consciousness. When I'm fully aware, that's the reality. And then I begin creating relationships, that radiate that kind of level. So feedback is vitally important. Awareness and feedback are huge. The essence of all learning is feedback and repetition. And that's the law of karma. We learn by doing stuff again and again, watching the results, and adjusting our behavior accordingly. Somebody who hasn't spoken yet, Jane.
Okay, I want to go back to your initial, where you were talking about, being in the present moment, and then being connected to the past and being able to imagine into the future. And I want to tie in a little bit to what Mike just said. It seems to me, and I'm going to tell you my current level of model and then let you comment. To me, it seems like if the goal, which I accept as premise, is to be in my heart and to ready myself and get as many obstacles and, shadow stuff out of the way so that I can actually be an embodiment for light, not, the big light, then it almost seems like I have to be grounded in the present. I have to have my feet on the ground. I can't go flying out there. But I also need to be cognizant of my past, because that is what you just said, the lessons that I bring forward into my experience. But beyond that, the imagination, it seems like the imagination takes me out beyond the immediate experience to the creation of the possibilities, and the possibilities in light, hopefully. I just finished a course called the Prison Path of Freedom, which is a training course to train you to go into prisons. And one of the things that was so striking to me in this class was these techniques really were about understanding your basic goodness and being in a space of love. I mean, that was really the ultimate goal, but those weren't the words. And when people moved to that, they had light around them. These are people who had murdered people and things like that, and you would see them on these videos, and these people had light around them. So it almost seems to me, kind of addressing a little my view of what Mike said, is that when someone is stuck in suffering, and there's, either because they were beaten and treated hideously as a child, which is actually very common in that population, giving them the tools, not the judgment, but the tools to transcend that, actually seems like that would be an amazing service. And to accept that they are where they are in a space of love doesn't mean that it's okay for them to hang out and hate people and kill.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to stop there and let you fill in the blanks for me.
And that's the importance of the feedback system. Because wherever I'm stuck, I'm going to stay stuck unless I continue to learn. And learning is about repetition and feedback from what I do. If that clock back there were, a dartboard, and you and I are standing here and we're throwing darts at it, It's watching where the darts land that allow us to improve our performance. If I were to hang a sheet midway between and say to you, Jane, I need you to throw the darts over the sheet at the dartboard that you can't see, you couldn't improve your aim. It's the feedback that's telling you, oh, I'm going too far to the right or too low or whatever. So feedback is essential. But feedback is predicated on a model that says to me, I need to move in a particular direction. So what is that model toward which I'm attempting to move? And I'm convinced that the only model worth moving toward is a model of love. Nothing else works. Demonstrably, nothing else works. You look at, the last 5,000 years of human history, since the agricultural revolution in 3000 BC and the rise of empires, and we've attempted to solve human problems, by killing people. And it has never worked. It's just created more warfare. And so obviously of all the models out there, the model that only works, the one proposed by Jesus Christ and Mahatma Gandhi and the Buddha, were about awareness and about love. And that's the only one that's going to deliver the goods. And so whatever techniques we can create that allow people or inspire people, to move towards that, that is the only one that's going to pay dividends. Now, just in your first question, a little bit about the imagination. Imagination is not an escape from the now. What we don't realize is that when we incarnate, we create the illusion of time. And time is necessary for incarnation. But time is only an artifact of this particular state of consciousness. And it's because we have downsized from cosmic intelligence, to a little laptop we carry between our ears. And so we can't, appreciate the entire gestalt of reality. So we have to break it up into bite-sized pieces and then process them sequentially, thus giving rise to the illusion of time. When we step outside of that model, when you go off into the imagination, time doesn't exist in that way anymore. And you experience this yourself. When you dream every night, you're transcending the laws of physics, including time and space. You're transcending. I had a dream a few nights ago that Michael Choi was visiting a friend of mine in Kenya. Have you ever been in Kenya, Michael? No. You've never been in Kenya. You've certainly never met this old man, and this old man is dead right now. So here's an old man that I knew, 28 years ago in Kenya, who's now dead, and in my dream, Michael and he and this guy are having a dialogue. And so time and space don't, when you step outside. So when you go into the realm of the imagination, you're in a place of eternal possibilities. It's like if you check out a video to go home and it's an action movie, and you look, you watch the first 15 minutes, and then you can't wait. I got to see what the ending of this is going to be. And you fast forward to the end, and you look at the end, you say, "Oh, thanks be to God, the villain was overcome, or the good guy won, or whatever it is." Now, the truth is, the minute you picked up the video, the end was already there. But you were subject to a chronological viewing of it, and then at some stage you decided to fast forward. Now, imagination allows us to fast forward. Now, the problem is, if you rewind it back to where you were, and if you do that 15 times, the characters will continue to act in the movie as if they didn't know what the outcome was. They'll continue to say the same lines, make the same responses, although you've rewound it 20 times and you know what the end is, but as the characters in the drama, they don't know what the end is. So when we're stuck in time, we don't know what the end is. We keep doing the same thing again and again and again. When we can fast forward and see what it looks like at the other end, if we're totally loving beings, this is what it looks like. Then you can come back and you can start changing the dialogue even here. You don't have to rewind the video. You can create a brand new video. Yeah, you can split off and create a brand new video. Karen.
I just wanted to say something about...
So let's grab the...
I was just thinking about the importance of imagination in all those times, in looking at the past, the present, and the future. That it's not only about projecting forward,
Right.
but being imaginative in the way you look
Yes.
at your past.
Brilliant.
That it is really the possibilities of evolution there are just profound, as well as in the present moment of being able to pause in any situation and see your choices and see the roads that are unfolding
Totally. That's brilliant.
around you.
Brilliant. So we just pick one piece, but then we'll end there. It's 11 o'clock. How would you use your imagination for the past? Now, the truth is that when you look at the near-death experiences, one of the most fascinating characteristics of the near-death experience is the life review. And here's what people report, that their entire life is presented to them. And obviously they're outside of time, so it doesn't take even a nanosecond to have the entire experience of an entire lifetime. They do a review of their life, but it's much more complex than just remembering what happened. They're able to experience each event from the viewpoint of every participant in that event. So it's not just, oh gee, I'm sure she must have been feeling like this, or oh my God, I hope he wasn't thinking this. It's not like that. You're actually experiencing every single event from the viewpoint and the perspective of all the participants in that event. So your life review, is an experiencing of all the perspectives involved in every incidents. Now, you can do that with the past. That's what I mean by imagination into the past. If you use your imagination to go up into the past, you can take any event in your past, and instead of just remembering, I was 7 years old and this bully came across the schoolyard and he broke my nose. That may have been the event. You go back in your imagination and you create a whole context, and you begin to wonder, what made the bully what he was. What was the teacher doing when this? What was the teacher thinking? What were the other kids thinking? And you begin now to fill in all the blanks. And now you get a much more total experience of that event, which leads very, very often to compassion, but it certainly changes the equation. So imagination is not just a fanciful flight into a possible future. It's a technique that can be used in the present, about the future, and in the past as well. So guys, namaste. Thanks a million. Okay.